Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Avert webinar. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered today. We pay our respects to their elders and ancestors past, present, and emerging. Today, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Imogen Richards, who will be making the presentation today on her forthcoming book, The Aesthetic Politics of Far-Right Environmentalism. Dr. Imogen Richards is a senior lecturer in criminology at Deakin University. She researches the political economy of terrorism and counterterrorism, the mediation of political violence, and the performance of security in response to social crisis. She is the author and co-author of Neoliberalism and Neo-Jihadism, Criminologists in the Media, and Global Heating and the Australian Far Right. These works examine the political economy of neo-jihadism, political public criminology, and the intersections between climate change and far-right politics in Australia. Before I hand over to Dr. Richards, I would like to remind our participants to please submit their questions via the Q&A function and not the chat function. After Dr. Richards' presentation, I will open the floor to questions. You are more than welcome to submit your questions anonymously, but I will hand over to Dr. Richards. And we look forward to the presentation. Thank you.
So, good. Sharing. Okay. All right, so thanks everyone for coming along. So today I'm going to be talking about a forthcoming Palgrave pivot, which is titled The Aesthetic Politics of Far-Right Environmentalism. So this book basically is short, so in the sort of pivot series style, but it outlines or sketches out a broad framework for understanding far-right environmentalism and also what we might call pseudo-environmentalism through a lens of political aesthetics theory. So I do this in the book for the purpose really of trying to understand how various types of far-right actor along that spectrum use artistic and cultural imagery to try to promote their distinct political agendas. So the analysis in the book explores the ways in which these actors exploit social and environmental crises really, by employing visual strategies, as well as culturally resonant symbols sort of more broadly. And they do this in order to construct dichotomous us versus them understandings of these critical environmental, social, and economic issues. So the framework is based on Walter Benjamin's theory of the aestheticization of politics and other theories as well, including Jacques Rancière's concept of the distribution of the sensible, among some of his other theories. And these are used to collectively analyse how different far-right groups and organisations normalise their ideologies and how they seek to mobilise support from particularly susceptible online audiences. So won't go into too much more detail about the aims at this stage, but broadly the book draws on cases that involve visual media, which is distributed on mainstream and alt tech platforms. And some of the key subjects and cases that I look at include European political parties, coalitions of political parties, but also online, more anonymous white supremacist and white nationalist collectives, including sort of white nationalist currents within trad life and trad wife communities, and also producers and proponents of fash wave and schizo wave media. Okay, so I've got the chapter breakdown on this slide. So really the discussion throughout the book, across the chapters, engages with different theoretical and conceptual ideas on far-right political ecology. And these range from ideas of eco-fascism to different types of what we can call green nationalism, as well as extreme right accelerationist ideas, which are celebrating notions of societal collapse. So to briefly explain what's in each of the chapters, I'll give you a bit of an overview. The first chapter outlines key tenets of political aesthetics theory, as well as where this investigation sits within the existing research field. And it also provides a background summary of some of the contemporary circumstances of global heating and international and domestic economic inequalities that the book and the propaganda it looks at responds to. So the second chapter outlines a conceptual framework for understanding what ecofascism, green nationalism, and accelerationism are, including how they relate to the investigation of the images and other media, and also to one another. So a key aim of the project in that regard was to try to destabilize, if you like, this notion that different currents and degrees of extremity in far-right political responses to environmental issues like climate change are entirely discrete or divorced from one another. So the framework tries to show the ways in which they relate to one another without doing a sort of moral equivalence in the analysis. So it does this in part by emphasizing the utilitarian propagandizing nature of the different ideologies. And this isn't, though, also to say that all of the expressions that I'm looking at in the book of environmentalism or pseudo-environmentalism are always cynical or disingenuous. So, for example, at one point, the book does look at pretty limited but still present far-right engagement with ideas of economic degrowth and other sorts of sort of more concerted planning ideas about economic responses to climate change. But primarily, and beginning then with the analysis, really in the second chapter, the book tries to draw connections between the different far rightist traditions that are more dominant and more utilitarian. And we also, I also in the book try to show as well some of the connections between these further rightist ideas, but also how they sort of gain purchase by tapping into or trying to sort of ideologically access more mainstream and prevalent ideas. And these can be have sort of quasi-Malthusian ideas or populationist ideas about climate change, which is speaking about a need for sort of radical depopulation, particularly in sort of less advantaged parts of the world. So this chapter also tries to set out a framework for understanding different ideas of sustainability and ecology. So it thinks as well about ideas of ecological succession, which is referring to the notion that humans and plants and animals developed in a linear fashion toward a so-called ideal state. And it thinks about some of the vulnerabilities in these sort of actual ecological historical ideas and how these are sort of vulnerable to cooptation by the far right and how they can sort of feed into or be used to support more binary hierarchical conceptions of human value, which are quite sort of eugenicist and speciesist as well in nature. So I won't spend very long here just going over everything that's in every chapter, but just to give you a bit of a sort of potted summary of the remaining analysis chapters. The next chapter particularly looks at sort of beyond just political parties to look at expressions of sort of ecofascism, I suppose, and focusing on Casa Pound in Italy as a case study, as well as sort of trad wife collectives. The subsequent chapter as well does sort of take a step back and look at the more institutional currents through sort of expressions of green nationalism, speaks a little bit about sort of further right-wing European political parties and coalitions of parties as well. And then the final, I suppose, analysis chapter before the conclusion in chapter 6 looks at really the sort of extreme right end of the spectrum and these sorts of a kind of apocalyptic accelerationist ideas, which are communicated in largely anonymous sort of fash wave and schizo wave media. So I think just to point out one interesting, I thought, kind of I thought, insight from this sort of really broad comparison is to look at the different types of sort of syncretism that are employed. So we're not really just looking at more systematic or systemic forms of syncretism in the cooptation of environmental campaigns or the repurposing and repackaging of environmental campaigns by sort of white nationalist groups, really. But we're also looking at, again, a syncretic appropriation of sort of countercultural themes and ideas. And again, obviously, that has its historical resonances as well with, syncretism with sort of fascist and proto-fascist groups in history. So here, for example, trad wife and trad life communities, importantly, are not homogeneously far right, but those that I'm looking at are espousing some of those viewpoints as well. And they're also sort of incorporating countercultural themes in favour of homesteading, which actually harken to kind of cottagecore online themes. And they were really popular with and were really originally developed by kind of queer online communities as well. But those ideas are introduced, for example, also in the service of promoting a kind of ultra-traditionalist, kind of reactionary, but quite anti-feminist ideas, and also promoting sort of the idea of rural ethnostates as well. So more explicitly bringing in those really quite far right, we can say, white nationalist ideas and associating that with those cultural or countercultural elements. So central to the book's analysis really is Benjamin's notion of the aestheticization of politics. So here, art and culture are weaponized to glorify power, domination, and violence. So across several key texts, Benjamin argued that this aestheticization obscures oppression by presenting it in captivating visual and emotional formats, which desensitize really audiences to the brutality of those messages or the political policies that they're promoting and conveying. So it basically is done in the service of rendering fascist and far-right ideologies more acceptable and palatable. So Benjamin's critique of the aestheticization of politics is also juxtaposed with other theories which sort of differ and complement in different ways. So one of these theories is Jacques Rancière's concept of the distribution of the sensible. So my analysis tries to draw on his idea of how aesthetics shape what is visible, sayable, and perceptible within a given political order. So I also try to draw on his notion of the aesthetic regime, which here explains the role of art in shaping political subjectivities. So just to briefly elaborate on that, Rancière contrasts the aesthetic regime with earlier or other ones, including the ethical regime of images, where art was judged by its alignment with truth and morality, the representational or poetic regime, where art followed rules of genre, hierarchy, and mimesis, whereas the aesthetic regime seeks to sort of disrupt these orders and recognizes art as autonomous, but not, and therefore not bound really to predetermined functions of truth or morality or of representation. So importantly, I just say as well, in the regime of art and politics, art is political not because it conveys a message, but because it reconfigures the field of perception. It makes new things visible or audible, and in doing so, it reconstitutes how people understand themselves as subjects. And it ultimately defines the boundaries of legitimacy within a given social order. So briefly, another idea of Rancière's, which I do draw on, is this idea of what he terms dissensus, which is this rupture to the established order of perception. Again, that reconfigures what's visible, sayable, and conceivable. And sometimes this is explained through a process, sort of a Foucauldian idea of denormalization. And this is the process of destabilizing entrenched, stratified social orders and opening up new spaces for alternative subjectivities and new forms of participation. So importantly, Rancière emphasizes that by virtue of the ambivalence of art, its capacity for dissensus isn't guaranteed, and its interpretation is always vulnerable to cooptation or subversion. So I say this is particularly useful in understanding the kind of superficial anti-capitalist critiques of some of the right-wing actors I'm looking at, and the kind of countercultural appeal they're trying to tap into, but also the more systemic and organised forms of, I guess, ideological and informational manipulation that they employ when they're talking about pseudo-environmentalist and environmentalist ideas. So Benjamin's dualism does draw a sharp distinction between the emancipatory potential of politicized art and the oppressive spectacle of aestheticized politics, by contrast to Rancière. So this reflects his more binary kind of Marxist orientation, which prioritized art's capacity to serve revolutionary praxis. And that's by fostering collective awareness and action. So his theory is attuned to the ways in which ideological manipulation can operate through mass media. So it was useful in explaining, as we know, the fascist spectacles of the 20th century, exemplified in the Nazis' uses of video media, for example. And I say it's also useful in this book in understanding the mass reproducibility of far-right audiovisual media today. So the technological transformations that he attends to are also needed to be attended to, really, in the context of the sort of mass dissemination and circulation of the types of counterfactual pseudo-environmentalist information now. But then Rancière's emphasis on contingency and ambivalence of the art itself is useful in offering a broader lens through which to examine the syncretism and adaptability of far-right aesthetics, and their utility in either disrupting or reinforcing dominant power structures. So I won't keep talking about the theory as much, just to give you some sort of examples. On this slide, I've got some images from the next chapter, chapter 3's exploration of ecofascism, really. And this is looking at cases which exemplify far-right tendencies, particularly towards syncretism and their use of trolling as political aesthetic. So this investigation specifically explores how digitally active organisations like Casa Pound Italia engage in performative environmental acts like rubbish collection and tree planting in order to project a certain image of ecological responsibility. So just in case anyone's unfamiliar, Casa Pound is a neo-fascist movement that was founded in Rome in 2003. It began as a squat, sort of providing housing for Italian families, and it later expanded into a network of social centres and a political party that was promoting fascism for the 21st century. So it did contest local, national and European elections, but won only marginal support and formally withdrew from electoral politics a few years ago. But instead, and as well, it's been focusing on cultural activism and spectacle in order to normalise far-right ideas within Italian society. So this chapter looks at Casa Pound's output, and it also looks, the other key examples are white nationalist and ultra-traditionalist ideas communicated within sort of trad wife collectives as well. So the chapter tries to specifically emphasise how the material realities underpinning the narratives espoused or promoted by groups like Casa Pound and the online sort of trad life collectives expose significant contradictions in their frameworks and their political messaging. So the movements and groups operate primarily on digital platforms that are disproportionately accessible to people in countries in the global north, and that is also supported by global supply chains, which are fundamental to the sorts of global inequalities and technologies that they often critique. So despite their various alleged opposition to globalization, their sort of parochial messaging, or their claims to sort of cultural emancipation or offering a means for that, or resistance to oppressive power, I'm trying to unpack in this chapter how these collectives and organizations are really deeply embedded in the global systems of resource extraction, labor exploitation, which they also critique, and that also impacts their intended audiences locally. So maybe just to really briefly elaborate, the contradictions aren't really just evident, for example, in trad life kind of communities, or the far right trad life communities, I should say, sort of just through the fact of them sometimes influencers being financially reliant for fundraising on these sort of late modern technologies at the same time as they're promoting sort of I won't say pre-modern, like 1950s technological modes of living, but also, again, just to draw attention to the deeper structural elements of that. So reinforcing a sort of a domestic, I guess, white nationalist sort of privilege, particularly for ideas that, women should be able to have the choice in wealthy societies not to work. But they're sort of reinforcing that on a global level as well, just through really the reliance on the sort of material production and maintenance of the very technologies that they're relying on. So the rare earth minerals, as we know, which are essential for the sorts of digital infrastructure they use, are extracted under exploitative conditions, often involving child labor. And then the assembly is carried out of the digital devices in precarious labor conditions in the global south. And of course, the content moderation is outsourced to people working very long days in developing nations. So I'm thinking of people working in the Philippines for 15 hours a day looking at hate speech, for example. So these systems are rendered invisible, really, by some of the types of mimetic images, really, projected in these sorts of far-right media. So there also probably isn't time for me to go into another core kind of narrative that I do look at in the chapter, but just to give you, a brief summary, Casa Pound's promotion of a corporatist model of economic development and governance, really, and nuclear technology in connection with this obviously harkens to Mussolini's corporatist model, but also to sort of a centralization of economic power, and also is potentially inadequate in terms of nuclear energy to address the sorts of harmful impacts of global heating that they signpost. And just as an example of how they're sort of casting themselves in opposition, I suppose, to, the sort of what they would sort of say to be, the sort of oppressive aspects of late modern capitalism and global governance. This top right image reads of Greta Thunberg, reads Greta's Industry, who is behind Thunberg Inc. and how to envision a different environmentalism, the new must-read issue, and so on. So SPA here as well is written, and that's referring to, forgive my pronunciation, Società per Azioni, or joint stock company in Italian. So the next chapter looks at how far-right political parties and affiliated organizations in Europe integrate environmental themes in their messaging, often through a lens of far-right green nationalism, which is really emerging of environmental concerns with ultranationalist agendas, often framing the protection of land and resources as tied to defending the nation and its dominant sort of ethnocultural group. So proponents, such as, for example, the National Rally, might use ecological arguments to justify anti-immigration policies and sort of broadly socially discriminatory or exclusionary politics and policies. And this sort of tends to mark the key distinction between these tropes, and global or more sort of justice-oriented forms of environmentalism. So these groups might tend as well to attribute environmental issues to overpopulation and migration. And the effect is that non-white communities often, and communities that are otherwise racialized through religion and in other ways, are sort of scapegoated for global issues like climate change. And the narratives aren't looking as well at the systemic drivers, but they are sort of referring often to these fairly simplistic narratives of population reduction, really, and sort of assuming that there's a one-to-one usage of resources. And that's what's contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. But not also looking at systemic drivers as well, like sort of global industrial supply chains or built-in obsolescence for technologies, or global freight, where a lot of oranges, for example, have in recent history been dumped off of the shores there in order to keep the prices high. So these sorts of systemic issues are under-addressed. So often these groups would romanticize pre-industrial landscapes, and they would advocate for sort of racially, if you like, homogenous societies, and they try to portray aspects of modernity as threats as well, both to cultural traditions and at the same time the integrity of ecological systems. So drawing on Benjamin's concept of now time and Roncier's theories of dissensus and denormalization in this chapter, I'm also trying to unpack a bit the anti-intellectual and counterfactual informational environment in which these sorts of narratives can circulate. And just to unpack that really briefly, I try to look at how this is sort of redolent of historical organized fascism and its rejection of rationality and evidence and literature, but also how it's reinforced through this sort of instrumentalist and neoliberal understanding of truth as really binary. Something is or is not correct. There's not different knowledges of that, but also it's very perspectivist in a sort of Nietzschean sense, which I can go into a bit more later if we have time. And so in this sense, it's really the sort of truth or scientific facts are really only important to some of these organizations and groups insofar as that truth has material value or political utility for them. So as an example as well, I'm looking at the AFD's Facebook page and looking at their Germany but normal campaigns. And so this is positioning the party against what it argues to be a corrupt traffic light coalition comprised of the German political parties of the Social Democrats, the Free Democratic Party, and the Greens. So they seek to present nuclear energy as normal, a rational, apolitical, technologically advanced solution to environmental challenges. And then they're, in doing this, sort of obscuring as well the deep connection that this tech and these models of economic and environmental governance can have to centralized and industrialized economies, and also the sort of limitations of that for addressing systemic ecological or environmental crises, which is now emerging more in the literature, which is not really my area of expertise, but I do speak about it a bit. Sort of human geography, economic anthropology literature, which is really stressing the need for systemic change in how societies are organizing energy production and consumption. So the romanticist and futurist aspects of propaganda on the part of the AFD and coalitions like the Alliance for Peace and Freedom can also be understood through Benjamin's conception of history. But this is not a linear continuum, but a constellation of fragmented moments that can then be sort of reactivated and recontextualized to serve these contemporary ideological objectives. So this dynamic is exemplified, for example, in far-right campaigns that simultaneously romanticize nature at the same time as invoking cultural heritage and mobilizing notions of racial breeding and these ideas of sort of futurity and family. And here, non-white populations, I don't have these sorts of images up here, but non-white populations are sort of framed as existential threats to a nationally bound, territorially defined population. So again, just to look at bring a theory and the historical comparison in a little bit, as with historical iconography in fascist Italy, where speed and innovation were celebrated alongside notions of a Roman imperium, contemporary far-right visions of futurity are often aestheticizing these ideas of purity, whether it be ecological, cultural, or demographic. And this might include imagery of pristine forests, idyllic rural landscapes, or smiling white families that are symbolically really linking natural environments to ideas of racial identity and demographic renewal. And maybe I don't need to spell this out in too much more detail, but some of these racialized visions of the future are really deeply connected to extreme right white supremacist rhetoric, which was, as we know, captured infamously in the 14 words of the former leader of the US terrorist organization, The Order. David Lane's words being, "We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children." So there's sort of cross promotions as well between the far right political parties of policies which would encourage the growing of large families among among certain people within their societies. And also this is accessing sometimes sort of blood and soil rhetoric. So you'll often sort of see the lauding of those sorts of policies with a imagery of sort of tree shoots or something like that. And of course, in far-right discourse at the moment, this notion of demographic crisis, so the Great Replacement, as it's often called now, so this sort of latest kind of white genocide conspiracy idea, is often semantically associated with these ecological concerns for the, I guess, summary purpose of sort of saying this idea of racial preservation is a prerequisite for environmental stewardship. So this is the last sort of main slide in the last analysis chapter, which I'll speak about. So there is a summary chapter after this, but the main part of the analysis is chapter 5, culminating in a look at the really extreme right types of fash wave and schizo wave media, which is often put out by usually anonymous online collectives. So the discussion here explores how these forms of media combine popular cultural references with white supremacist and accelerationist propaganda, and also often incorporate nature or sort of landscape imagery to construct narratives of social crisis or impending collapse. So fash wave blends 1980s sort of synthwave trends and music, which I do speak about a little bit in it, as with visual aesthetics that have far-right iconography. And that's often invoking and evoking nostalgia for an imagined past, whereas schizo wave is sort of characterized by surreal, disorienting visuals, and it's often drawing on what are called Hyperborean aesthetics. So Hyperborean aesthetics draw on the myth of Hyperborea, which is an imagined northern land associated with purity, strength, and transcendence. And in contemporary far-right media culture, this can entail sort of imagery of icy or alien landscapes, sort of mythic antiquity, heroic endurance, and here northern symbolism is really used to evoke ideas of racialized belonging and spiritual transcendence. So both fash wave and schizo wave subgenres tend to promote accelerationist objectives by portraying contemporary systems really as irredeemably broken and advocating societal collapse as a precursor to the establishment of a new ethno-nationalist and authoritarian political order. So the analysis in this chapter engages with Rancière's theory of the distribution of the sensible and Benjamin's concept of historical mythic recollection. So I speak a bit about the angel of history as well here. So it also tries to consider the role of new technologies in facilitating the dissemination of these types of aesthetic forms. So it examines how this imagery and these images are framed as a remedy for the alienation and despair which is engendered by neoliberalism, including its online expressions. So as we know as well, the sort of ideas of atomization or alienation and the ties of that to sort of online culture and the particularly sort of viral consumption of some of these sorts of psychologically addictive materials are also kind of signposted and really exploited in these types of media as well. So I argue here really that these sorts of messages are reflecting an inverted sense of Benjamin's angel of history. So where a sense of loss is fostered among the target audiences, but it's also in the service of advancing a sort of a vision of a purified future. So again, see that futurist and romanticist blending of aesthetic elements. So the propaganda strategies examined in this chapter are taken to represent the apex of technological reproducibility in fascist aesthetic media. Phenomena such as fash wave and schizo wave are highly technologized, and they're often presented in abstract or surreal forms, and then they circulate on alt-tech forums and within far-right accelerationist communities. So these forms of representation often employ environmental and landscape imagery to construct narratives of social crisis and impending societal collapse. So these narratives are, again, linked to widespread concerns like dislocation, alienation, escalating wealth disparities, the effects of climate change, and sometimes this is done in a more kind of subtle way as well, such as with this wave imagery. So, for example, as well, the bottom right fash wave image employs neon visuals, combining far-right symbolism more broadly, which incorporates absurdist or nihilist or surreal themes. And these compositions are often set against futuristic landscapes, while referencing or sort of storm type landscapes, as you can see as well there, while referencing historical fascist events. So this is a kind of style of retrofuturism influenced by 1980s and 1990s visual culture, but it also incorporates the large circular symbol of the Sonnenrad or black sun. And I'm sure that most people would know what that is, but just briefly, the symbol signifies Aryan purity and mysticism. It was a key element in the ideological development of esoteric Nazism, featured in Heinrich Himmler's design of the SS's Wavelsberg Castle, for example. It continues to be used frequently by occultists and esoteric Nazis, neo-Nazis today. So it was also as well on the cover of the so-called manifesto published by the Australian perpetrator of the mass shooting at 2 mosques in Christchurch in 2019. So the stormy sky with the lightning and the dark clouds evokes a fascistic kind of trope, promoting the destruction of an old order and an imminent catastrophe. Just to go quickly through, the central figure in the image, a monkey holding a pillow featuring an anime-style illustration, introduces this absurd and kind of disjointed element, which is actually typical of mimetic online far-right internet culture. The reference to monkeys is also rooted in the historical racist aprophobic trope that dehumanized Black people by associating them with primates. The image of that person holding a pillow on which appears a cartoon illustration of a scared-looking white girl is also invoking the racist trope of Black men as sexually predatory to white women. So another part of the analysis, just briefly, just got a couple of minutes, the massive ocean wave. So it's similar to the sort of famous Japanese wave imagery as well. But it also, I sort of argue in the analysis, abstractly represents a wolf, embodying the disorienting and chaotic aesthetic of schizo-wave media. And the association between nature and destruction is reinforced really by the wolf's presence. The wolf is really a recurring symbol for the far right. It embodies predatory instincts, survivalism, racial purity, and primal strength. It's carrying as well these strong Nietzschean connotations, invoking the concept of Übermensch, a historical Nazi trope representing a transcendent figure capable of reshaping society through dominance, predation, really, and the will to power. So the Sonnenrave inscription there is also accompanied by a caption which reads, "Based Zogmerica." So the term Zogmerica is referring to the Zionist occupation government conspiracy theory, which alleges that a Jewish cabal secretly controls governments, particularly in the US, by manipulating societal and economic systems to undermine non-Jewish populations. So Hyperborean aesthetics, just briefly in the remaining image in the top right, are also embraced by some far-right and extreme right individuals and collectives as an example of a dislocating and ethereal expression of sort of fash wave and schizo wave imagery. So these aesthetics are often characterized by the convergence of mythological symbolism and racialized ideology and environmental imagery. So essential to this visual narrative is the ancient Greek legend of Hyperborea, again, and that's appropriated to construct a vision of racial strength, purity, and the loss of a golden age. So Hyperborea is really imagined here as both a mytho-historical origin and a future destination for an idealized Aryan race. So here in these images, stark, desolate landscapes are often depicted as icy, barren, and inhospitable, and they serve as markers of purity and isolation. So these settings symbolize a rejection of perceived decadence and multiculturalism of modernity, and they contrast this with an imagined primordial wilderness sometimes, which is sort of preserved by a racially pure elite. So the imagery in this example is kind of cosmic rather than terrestrial, but it similarly glorifies harsh, unforgiving environments, which might be traditionally associated with Nordic or far northern landscapes. And such depictions valorize survival under these extreme conditions. So these are basically proving grounds for racial ingenuity and strength. And just very quickly to sum up my point about those types of images as well, I'm arguing in this chapter that images such as these two sort of ethereal figures in radiant white standing before a glowing spacecraft reflects, again, this romanticist futurist aesthetic trend. And I also argue that it kind of taps into these alien Aryan theories, which claimed that the so-called Aryan race originates from an extraterrestrial or divine source. And so obviously those theories are kind of going back to pre-Nazi Germany as well. So these theories were rooted in racial pseudoscience, as is sort of the notion of Aryanism, and also mystical nationalism. And they're seeking to construct a mythologized racial identity that's neither historically nor scientifically valid, but it remains central to esoteric fascist belief systems, and it's sort of offering a form of escapism from the sort of fear and catastrophism that's sort of brought about by contemporary crises like global heating. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Imogen. What a very, very interesting presentation. I would like to invite the participants to please submit your questions via the Q&A function, as we have around 10 to 15 minutes to facilitate the Q&A session. I think while I wait for our participants to submit a few questions, Imogen, there are 2 or 3 questions that I would like to pose to you. Maybe I'll pose both to you and then you can answer these consecutively. Are these types of media circulating on mainstream social media spaces? And how do they speak to recruit or attract a far-right audience? And the second part of that question is, why is it important to try and counteract the narratives of the far-right in the way that you have with your analysis? Are there ways in which these can represent possible counter-narratives or alternative narratives to the far-right's claims? Over to you.
Thanks, Isel. Okay, so most of the so the images were sourced from both mainstream and alt tech. So Telegram, Tumblr, Facebook, Instagram, primarily. So I was looking at sort of open surface web, I guess, platforms. But I think I'd probably make the additional point, which I didn't get to, which is that there are more of these types of images as well. Like there's quite a lot of fash wave imagery in the Daily Stormer, Andrew Anglin's magazine, which is only sort of accessible, I think, via the dark web. And these types of images as well can sort of act as a filter as well for people to really capture those susceptible, often young, in the case of the sort of extreme right fash wave and schizo wave images, which are, have that countercultural appeal and purchase. For particularly audiences which are engaging in sort of increasingly viral ways with these extreme spaces. So the point I would make, I suppose, is that these, in terms of the wider organizational or recruitment utility and strategy behind some of these messaging, particularly the extreme right messaging tactics, is that they're intended to act as a funnel, sort of to capture. And then from there, you'll often see kind of links to more extreme material and more closed spaces, which then require, moderator access. And those are the spaces in which you'd see planning for acts of political violence, for example, more likely to take place. And I'm thinking as well, even this isn't even necessarily all sort of on the dark web. Obviously, there's Telegram and sort of Terragram and sort of the members of accelerationist communities, which have been really active there. So yeah, that's enough probably maybe to answer that first bit. The second point, I think that it's important to counteract those narratives, or that there's potentially more promise in doing that through not really through trying to sort of close down and say, well, these are not viable solutions to the crises and the feelings and of precarity and sort of psychological ill health, which these groups are trying to access. So an effective rejoinder to that potentially isn't, as we know already, I think, to say, well, let's go back to a stable centre, and these problems are not as bad as you think, and that these are non-viable solutions, and you just need to sort of go along as per usual. I think actually trying to use some of the other sorts of more radical and transformative messages, which sort of seek to, I guess, thinking of seek to bring about or sort of address the potentials for sort of political violence and discrimination through sort of enhancing social justice rather than closing down change. I think that promoting that sort of a civic engagement as well, and then being open to looking at sort of the types of ideas which are a bit more radical, can be more critical of a political mainstream. I think that's probably really vital in order to actually politically engage those audiences.
Thanks, Imogen. Another question that came up, as you know, one of the main objectives of the Avert Research Network is kind of to bring together academia to the world of practitioners. So a question that came up anonymously was, are there particular images or symbols that resonate more strongly with Australian audiences in this context? And have you seen similar uses of environmental issues by far-right groups in Australia? And if so, which examples stand out?
Are there types of images which are more sorry, I've got a frog, which are more popular in the Australia? So I think there's a couple of things I would say about that, and then I will ask you to repeat the second part after that. But the sorts of images that we see here are often not trying to access the same sorts of blood and soil tropes as sort of like the European identitarians would, for example, because they're not hearkening to or trying to claim pride in a longer history of sort of a certain people's occupation of land. It's pride in settler colonialism, and that's about economic uses of the land. So, for example, we see a sort of a repackaging and a signposting and really a promotion of Australian political histories and myths, which aren't intrinsically all, something we would call far right now, but they can be inflected and used that way. So an example of just the environmental dimensions of that would be the economic uses of the land, which are associated with the word digger. So that is referring to Anzac mythology, and it's also referring to gold mining. So pride in agriculture, agrarianism as well, are sort of leveraged and used by white nationalists to say that, we or their intended audience have a right to sort of exclusive claims of ownership of lands and territories, and actually exclusive occupation in the case of some, obviously, organisations and groups want to establish rural sort of whites and only ethno-states. And that's, in their narratives, justified not so much by the same kinds of blood and soil rhetoric that we would see in maybe in a European case, for example, But here and in Canada, the US, New Zealand to an extent as well, it's a real explicit sort of settler colonial pride. And then sometimes speaking about international examples, talk about sort of, Rhodesia. They'll try to sort of evoke those histories as well. And maybe just briefly to add on to that, there's the obvious policies with it. There's the obvious history of the treatment of Indigenous people within Australia, which is celebrated by those communities. And it's also now, particularly with the kind of half or sort of small attempts at launching political parties by sort of extreme right people groups here, that have been done previously with Fortitude Australia, and is now sort of happening a little bit again, is really predicated on this idea of Australia for the white man, which I think was actually a byline, maybe in the Bulletin, but anyway, an old sort of Australian magazine, but also saying we need to return to the white Australia policy, which was obviously prescribing relatively exclusive Western European migration to Australia until its sort of more formal dissolution in 1973. So what was the second part of the question?
So the first one was, are there any particular images or symbols that resonate more strongly with the Australian audiences in this context? And then the second part was, have you seen similar uses of environmental issues by far-right groups in Australia? And what examples stand out? So
I think specifically thinking about the imagery, there's sort of obviously on the part of popular or well-known groups, sort of hiking imagery, that was sort of featured a lot in the sort of news media reportage, investigative news media reportage about those groups, singing Waltzing Matilda, while doing a fascist salute, that sort of thing, in the Cathedral Ranges, I think that was, regional Victoria. Which, anyway. So there's obviously those sorts of, sort of that sort of Australiana imagery that's used. The sort of blending of that with these new, I think there's been a bit of talk about sort of active clubs and whether that kind of idea is particularly gaining purchase here like it has elsewhere. But I think the sort of training in combat sports in outdoor settings is a particularly kind of, it's the European identitarians, generation identity did explicitly that. And a lot of the imagery seems to be quite similar, wearing uniforms, walking and marching in formation, as well as doing the sort of boxing, combat sports and training. And those both being in outdoor settings. And of course, they harken back to the sort of German Nazi youth Wandervogel movement, which wasn't actually intrinsically Nazi at the beginning, but then was taken over by them. And that was, about, young people within the sort of Nazi establishment, political establishment, hiking through sort of the German forests, and that being a way of establishing a sort of a spiritual connection that now people might refer to, if it's talking about racial exclusivity, as kind of eco-fascist. So there's particularly the sort of hiking imagery is trying to ideologically access those tropes. There are other groups as well that do sort of small conservation kind of activities, like the Australian Nativists Association. They've called themselves that after, and they're not very big, excuse me, but called themselves that after the historical, Mutual Society, which was really populous and did have several former Australian prime ministers as members. So really explicitly trained. So they would do things like planting trees and picking up rubbish, which is a little bit more similar to the Casa Pound. And in terms of, actual environmental imagery used by sort of the extreme right, or talking about climate change, I don't think that there's as much engagement with that. We did a study of that looking at Stormfront. And so there was quite a lot of explicit engagement there, but I'm not really sure actually about the extent of engagement with actual climate change policies. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Imogen. I really appreciate your detailed answers to the questions posed. Before I conclude this very, very interesting webinar, I would like to invite the participants to, if you are not already subscribed to the Avert Research Network newsletter, please subscribe by visiting our website. Please subscribe also to the Avert YouTube channel. We will be uploading the recording of this webinar to the YouTube channel and onto the website. We are also inviting you to please visit the Avert website. We have an upcoming webinar on the 3rd of September, which will feature Dr. Emma Belton and the public release of the profiles of individual radicalization in Australia, the PIRA database, which I know will be very interesting to our network of practitioners. There are several other webinars also scheduled for the rest of the year, so please have a look at our Avert website. Please register for these webinars. And I wish everyone a wonderful rest of the day and weekend. Thank you again, Imogen. Goodbye, everyone.
Yes, thanks for coming. Bye.
Bye.